Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Please take your seats. We're ready to get started with the California State Senate's Committee on Energy, Utilities, and Communications. We're going to begin as a subcommittee of the committee to hear testimony on bills, beginning with Senator Bill Moning's SB 968, the Diablo Canyon Units 1 and 2 power plants legislation. While we can't act on this, we can definitely ask questions and hear testimony from the public. So welcome, Senator Moning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Appreciate the opportunity to present SB 968. I'd like to start by accepting the committee's suggested amendment to include beneficial impacts as part of the economic assessment. Senate Bill 968 calls for an economic assessment, and from that, identification of contingencies for mitigation planning of adverse impacts of the San Luis Obispo region in the event that Diablo Canyon might close either temporarily or permanently. This work would be completed by an independent third party and submitted to the California Public Utilities Commission by July 1st, 2018. Diablo Canyon is the last operating nuclear power plant in California, and there's ample reason to believe that the plant may not operate past its current licensure due to regulatory requirements from multiple state and federal entities. The San Luis Obispo region relies heavily on the tax revenues and economic benefits derived from Diablo Canyon. According to county tax rules, PG&E is the largest private employer and largest property taxpayer in the county, and much of this is attributable to its operations at Diablo Canyon. Additionally, the public has no access or insight to PG&E's internal economic portfolio with respect to the continued operation of Diablo Canyon. This is even more concerning when we consider that the closure of the San Onofre nuclear generating station was the result of a sudden business decision that left the community ill-prepared. SB 968 assumes that closure is a likely possibility and seeks to proactively address the potential consequences of a closure in a manner designed to protect the public, the workforce, and the region. It is my hope that this bill will lead to informed conversations on orderly mitigation efforts and help the local community explore alternatives should Diablo Canyon close. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'd like to offer some witnesses in support. First, Mr. John Giesman on behalf of the Alliance for Nuclear Responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Monning. I want to be very clear from the outset. I'm an attorney for the Alliance for Nuclear Responsibility. My client is firmly of the belief that it would be in the best interest of PG&E's ratepayers if the plant closed tomorrow. But it's been very clear for a number of years. The Energy Commission, of which I'm a former member, has published reports for over a decade now about the concentration of the county tax base in PG&E, the potential adverse impact on schools in particular is a severe risk that truly needs to be mitigated by the ratepayers of PG&E across Northern California that have benefited from the electricity output of the plant. Much of the assessment of the risk of closure has been focused on the prospect that the United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission will not extend licenses that expire in 2024 and 2025. I want to emphasize my professional judgment that a much larger risk exists among decisions likely to be made by state agencies. The decision to close this plant will be influenced much more by Californians than by a faceless bureaucracy in Washington. The State Water Resources Control Board, as you know, is considering whether to apply its policy against once-through cooling to Diablo Canyon. Every other power plant along the coast has been forced into compliance. Diablo Canyon represents 78% of the existing once-through cooling water flows. The Water Board's policy will mean nothing if it's not applied to Diablo Canyon. That's a red flag. The California Coastal Commission, before the NRC ever is called upon to cast a vote on whether to extend the license or not, the California Coastal Commission must make a certification that the plant's relicensure would be consistent with the California Coastal Plan under the Federal Coastal Zone Management Act. When the Water Board was considering the once-through cooling issue last year, the Coastal Commission staff called Diablo Canyon the largest marine predator on the West Coast. That's a red flag. Probably more significant, though, and certainly closer in time, is the decision by the State Lands Commission that is pending in the next 2 years as to whether to extend leases for the intake and output facility.
If I can interrupt you, both San Onofre and Diablo Canyon were built before the Coastal Act
Yes, sir.
in 1975.
Yes, they were, Senator. And before CEQA in 1969. As a consequence, the State Lands Commission is now considering whether to require a full EIR for the extension of the intake and output leases at the plant. Those leases now expire in 2018 and 2019. If the Lands Commission were to extend the lease and enable a relicensing, it would increase the amount of nuclear waste generated by the facility by 82%. Now, if you assume that the Lands Commission might only extend the lease to the end of the current license, which I don't think is a realistic prospect, but if you made that assumption, it would increase the nuclear waste generated by the facility by 21%. Those are big numbers. And this is a decision going to be made by 3 constitutional officers in California, 2 of whom envision bright futures in statewide office, one of whom, my old boss, has a long history with the controversy surrounding this plant. In fact, one of the best film clips from that earlier era had a dark-haired Jerry Brown vowing to a cast of thousands of cheering people that he would do everything within his power to prevent the opening of the plant. That's a red flag. As a consequence, I think that it's important to assess how to mitigate adverse economic consequences in the county of San Luis Obispo if this plant happens to surprisingly close one night. Thank you very much.
Sure, yeah. Mr. Chairman, members, very quickly, Paul Yoder on behalf of the San Luis Obispo County Board of Supervisors. I don't think the senator characterized this as a district bill, but it's certainly a bill for his district. I think almost every member of the committee has one big employer. This is it in San Luis Obispo County. The county needs to figure out what will happen in the future, whether the plant stays open or whether the plant closes. Very grateful to the senator for trying to help us get there somehow, some way. So on behalf of the county's approximately 276,000 residents, I'd urge your aye vote on this bill. Thank you.
Good morning, Chair and members. Derek Lennox on behalf of the San Luis Coastal Unified School District. This is the school district that serves the surrounding area around the facility and its community. It has about 7,600 students in the school system. Because the school district receives the vast majority of its funding from either PG&E directly through unitary taxes or through local property taxes, which are affected by the largest employer in the area, the possibility of closing the plant creates enormous uncertainty for the school district in its ability to serve the students. We think, therefore, that the committee's analysis was particularly thoughtful when it pointed out that having a comprehensive understanding of all of the potential impacts of closure would be enormously helpful for groups like ourselves to be able to plan several years out and to figure out how best to serve the students and their families. So for that reason, I want to thank Senator Monning and his staff for bringing the bill, and thank you to the chair for considering it.
Kent Cowles, Pacific Gas and Electric. We have a supportive amended position. I apologize for not getting a letter into the committee. Would reference the comments in the analysis on page 3 about the cost recovery issue. That would be the one thing that we would seek to have clarified in there, just so there was no uncertainty at the PUC for cost recovery for the study. Thank you.
Do we have anybody in support of the bill like to step up at this time? Anybody in opposition?
Thank you. My name is Molly Johnson. I am a member of San Luis Obispo, Mothers for Peace, who has for 43 years fought the Diablo nuclear plant. We are official interveners in that plant. It is a clear and present danger to our community. I'm here today to present the opposition of 30 environmental, health, and other organizations to SB 968. They include groups such as Public Citizen, Greenpeace, Food and Water Watch, Physicians for Social Responsibility Los Angeles, and the Northern Chumash Tribal Council. The full list is identified in our written statement of objections, copies of which I request be distributed to the committee. Thank you. SB 968 would require Pacific Gas and Electric Company to submit an assessment of the adverse economic impact of the region surrounding the county of San Luis Obispo that could occur if Diablo Canyon Power Plants Units 1 and 2 were to temporarily or permanently shut down. We urge a no vote. Diablo Canyon represents one of the greatest environmental, public health, and economic threats to much of California. Each reactor contains 1,000 times the long-lived radioactivity of the Hiroshima bomb. The plant was built based on the assertion that there were no active earthquake faults within 30 kilometers of the plant. We now know that there are at least 4 faults, one of which is just a few hundred meters from the plant. The ground motion from an earthquake on any one of those faults could be far greater than the plant was built to withstand. Just as at Fukushima, which the 5th anniversary is happening now, a quake larger than the plant was designed for could release massive radioactivity and devastate a significant part of our state. The original construction began in 1967. Diablo was designed and licensed to operate for 40 years. Unit 1 was licensed in 1984 and Unit 2 in 1985. Some of the equipment is already over 40 years old. Nuclear proponents are pushing to extend operation for decades more, and we feel the risks are just too great. We need to quickly transition from Diablo to renewables, and it must not be allowed to run beyond its design life and original license period. Our reasons for the opposition to the bill are: the bill is unbalanced. It orders the study of the adverse impacts of a plant shutdown. The proposed amendment, while we appreciate it very much, we don't feel goes quite far enough to correct this imbalance. Intentionally or not, the bill's provisions pave way for approval to extend Diablo Canyon operations beyond its original design life. As written, the bill does not address the adverse environmental, health, and economic impacts of a meltdown or other type of radiation release. The bill is conceptually flawed. When Diablo closes, as it must at some point, that isn't the end of the story. The electricity produced by Diablo will be replaced by new power sources, many of them renewables. They will produce jobs and tax revenues, other economic, environmental, and health benefits. The issue is not simply what will be lost by a shutdown, but also what could be gained. There's no need for the requested analysis. PG&E in 2013 sponsored a study of the economic impacts of the plant. The number of jobs and the taxes paid are already well known. The requested new report is redundant and unnecessary and would impose on ratepayers an expense for no benefit. We recognize that the idea briefly referenced in the bill of also studying mitigation measures for job and tax losses may seem at first glance attractive, but the bill doesn't do anything substantive in that regard, and the harmful effects of the rest of the bill in terms of aiding in the push for continued operation beyond the original license period far outweigh that. The real need, which is not addressed in the bill, is for the state, the California Public Utilities Commission, California Energy Commission, to commence planning for the transition from Diablo to renewables. The licenses for Diablo expire in 8 and 9 years from now. Thoughtful planning for transitioning to new renewables needs to begin now. This would be a triple win: eliminating the risk of nuclear disaster in California, building up more renewables, and the jobs and other economic benefits that would come from that. And the bill doesn't do anything to put the state on that path. The bill would have PG&E identify contractors to perform the study. from which CPUC would select a supposedly independent third party to do the analysis. Given the troubled nature of the CPUC, the history of a too cozy relationship with PG&E, the controversy over the illegal ex parte communications with PG&E, and the CPUC's weak oversight of PG&E that contributed to the San Bruno disaster, the prospect remains high that the CPUC will do pretty much what PG&E wants. We note that a similar process resulted in a failure to select a truly independent third party to conduct a review of PG&E's proposal for an exemption from the Water Board's once-through cooling policy. The Water Board was supposed to arrange for an independent third party for this purpose to be paid for by PG&E, but PG&E's influence resulted in the selection of Bechtel Corporation, which had in fact helped PG&E construct Diablo Canyon and which produced a report backing PG&E. That report was called into question by many observers. The bill fails to put the state on record that Diablo Canyon should not run for decades longer than it was originally designed and licensed. In summary, the analysis the bill calls for is unnecessary and imbalanced and could amount to a state-ordered piece of advocacy for forces pushing for Diablo Canyon to operate far beyond its original design and license life. This could have great negative impacts in California.
Thank you, ma'am.
And we do recognize that, one more sentence, that the intent of the author and the co-authors is not, but that we feel that that could be an unintended consequence. And
Thank
we-
you, ma'am.
Yeah.
Appreciate your very well-prepared comments.
Thank you. My name is Daniel Hirsch. I am the director of the Program on Environmental and Nuclear Policy at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And I serve on the board of the Southern California Federation of Scientists and the Committee to Bridge the Gap, and it's on their behalf that I'm here today. I want to put into perspective why what you're about to do is so important, why this matters so much. Diablo Canyon, in my view, represents the greatest risk to this state from any other threat that we have. When it was constructed, PG&E, in its wisdom, claimed that there were no active earthquake faults within 30 kilometers and built the plant accordingly. Then they found the Hosgri fault and said there can't be any more. Then they found the San Luis Bay and Los Osos faults to be active, said there can't be any more. And then the USGS found the Shoreline fault, which comes within a few hundred meters of the plant. They then said these can't be connected to each other, and now we know they are connected. This legislature passed AB 1632 a few years ago by Senator Monning's predecessor, Sam Blakeslee, which required a series of seismic studies. PG&E said there was no need for them. They understood the seismic situation quite fine. The studies came back horrifying. Dr. Blakeslee and I were asked to testify before the U.S. Senate and Environment Committee about a year ago about the results. And these results show that these faults are capable of far more damage than the plant was originally designed for. So we face a situation in California that's akin to Fukushima, a plant that was designed to deal with a much smaller threat than actually could occur, partially due to the captured nature of the regulating system, something we have here as well. The problem is that if there were an event at Diablo, there are 15 billion curies of radioactivity inside each of those reactors. We measure permissible concentrations in picocuries, millionths of a millionth of a curie. You could wipe out, for all practical purposes in terms of productive use, a substantial portion of the state. It could be very much worse than Fukushima, because in Fukushima the wind blows from west to east, carried the radiation out over the ocean. Here it would carry it from the ocean to the Central Valley or to Los Angeles, or if the wind blew north up here, up to the Bay Area as well. We are talking about immense amounts of radioactivity, and we're talking about a company that has a safety culture problem. So the issue becomes, what does this legislature do to deal with that huge threat? And our problem with this bill is that rather than dealing with those matters, and I need to remind you that the state has lots of authority. In the PG&E versus Energy Commission case that went to the Supreme Court said the state has wide powers to be able to deal with nuclear power in the state. So the issue is, are we going to try to protect the state from that kind of an event? And instead, this legislation, though again we believe quite well intentioned, is very imbalanced. It asks for a review of all of the adverse economic impacts of shutting down. It doesn't try to get to the benefits of shutting down or the adverse impacts of melting down. And the amendment by the committee, accepted by the author, we think is helpful. But we note that it is only changing a few words in the first sentence of the bill, and that there are numerous other references throughout the bill to the adverse impacts supposed they're shut down, and to specifying which bad things to be examining without examining the benefits of shutting down. I want you to, in closing, I would like you to think about what would happen, what you would have to say to your children or your grandchildren if a year from now one of those faults moved, the Los Osos or the San Luis Bay or the Hosgri or the shoreline. Cooling was disrupted in the plant, the fuel melted, and hundreds of millions of curies were released into California. Your children and your grandchildren would ask you, what had you done to prevent that? This bill not only doesn't help prevent that, it creates a one-sided study arguing for continued operation, essentially what bad things would occur if we shut down. I know that's not the intent, but that is the effect. We've made clear that there are some amendments that we think could remove the opposition. So far, those haven't been accepted. We hope that the author will work with us and try to fix this in the future. But I just want to remind you, these reactors have 1,000 times the long-lived radioactivity of the Hiroshima bomb, and it only stays in the reactors so long as the cooling works, and that only occurs if there's not a terrorist event, PG&E doesn't screw up the way they did at San Bruno, or there isn't an earthquake that occurs on one of those faults. And we don't have a lot of time. That earthquake could occur tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have anybody else speaking in opposition to the bill? Okay, we're going to go to member comments, questions. Senator Leyva.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, Senator Monning. And my question really is to the opposition. When you talk about the cooling system, I know the plant was built a long time ago. Are you saying that the cooling system hasn't continued to be updated?
Very good question. The entire plant, including the coolant system, was based on the premise of no earthquake faults nearby. So when they found there were these faults, rather than upgrade the system by and large, they sharpened their pencils to change the analysis of how much of a ground shaking could occur from the earthquake. And that's what's so troubling, that PG&E style has not been to spend the money to increase the protections when we know there's a greater risk, but to try to get a friendly regulator to say they don't need to.
So they have not been updated since the plant was built?
When the Hosgri fault was discovered, they made some minor changes, but the vast majority of the changes that should have been made weren't, because they changed their assumptions about the shaking rather than changing the plant. Let me add one other point. You may remember that the one set of changes that they did make was to add some pipe snubbers and whip restraints, and then it turned out that they got them backwards. Do you remember this? Mm-hmm. The plants were built to mirror image blueprints of each other. And so when they put in these seismic upgrades for Unit 1, they used the blueprints for Unit 2, which were in the reverse place. And this was discovered at the last minute. They had to go back and redo it all, and that's why the cost escalated from $360 million to about $5 billion. But the new faults that have been discovered, they have not upgraded from, and that's deeply troubling.
Thank you.
Senator Gaines.
Just some questions of Senator Monning, if I could. Thank you for bringing your legislation forward. Can you tell me, because when I just look at this, I'm curious as to why ratepayers are paying for the study versus the county, because it seems to me that the economic impact could be on the county. So can you go through that rationale?
It's a fair
please?
question. It's one that hasn't come up in the testimony, so I'm glad that you ask it. I think you heard even from PG&E's testimony seeking a clarification. It's our view that it's fully appropriate in this type of study that ratepayers, that the costs be distributed among all ratepayers. It's not just ratepayers who benefit from the energy produced at Diablo Canyon. It would be all PG&E ratepayers. So when you diffuse it among all ratepayers, we believe it would be a very, very nominal cost to ratepayer and appropriate for ratepayer because we are asking this study to be done of potential adverse impacts of closure and now as amended benefits of closure. So we think it's appropriate. Certainly mitigation strategies. This bill does not say that PG&E is responsible for paying for mitigation. I don't believe it's silent on that. To me, that's another step forward. Certainly all residents of San Luis Obispo County will shoulder the impacts, positive or negative. We believe that, as has been forecast in the past, the many benefits to the economy provided by Diablo, you don't just put a negative sign in front of them to figure out adverse impacts. We have school districts dependent on that. We have 1 in every $10 spent in San Luis Obispo County is earned by an employee at PG&E. So we're willing to look deeper into that issue of ratepayer. I think it'll be an ongoing question as the legislation moves forward. But I think you'll find there's precedent that it's an appropriate diffusion of ratepayer responsibility.
And then do we have an idea of what the cost is, just a ballpark on the study?
I don't.
Okay. All right.
And we will be developing that as we go forward. One reason we don't have even an estimate on that is the shaping of what the study should include is still dynamic as the bill moves forward.
Okay. And I also read that it's a third-party
Yes.
independent study. I think some of the criticism is that they think that the study would be tilted
Biased,
in
right.
a particular
Right. So
perspective.
I think the
I'd like
reason
your
for that
response.
view, and just to give due credit to opposition perspective, PG&E would be first in line to select possible independent third parties, but it would be a selection made by the PUC. The PUC commission, as appointed by the governor and independent of PG&E,
Okay.
would make that selection.
Okay, so PG&E can make a recommendation, but the PUC has final decision?
That's correct.
Okay, great, thank
Good.
you.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
Very well. Any other questions? I'm sorry. Yes, well, we have a quorum now, so we'll go ahead and have the clerk call roll so we can get it officially established.
Wesso,
Here, present.
Wesso here, Morel.
Here.
Morel here, Canella. Canella here, Gaines. Gaines here, Hertzberg, Hill, Lara. Lara Hill, Leva. Leva here, McGuire. McGuire here, Pavley, Wolk. Thank you.
Very well. Did you want to make some?
Yes, if I
Rebutting
could,
comments
if
or
I could
closing
close,
comments?
thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, members, for your indulgence on this. It's interesting that we have opposition present today who believe that this bill is designed to make the case to keep Diablo Canyon open, and yet we have workers at Diablo who say this bill is designed to shut Diablo Canyon. The bill doesn't advocate closure or continued operation. What the bill seeks is to protect the residents of San Luis Obispo County, including the workforce, by understanding potential adverse consequences of an unexpected closure. We have the example of San Onofre with basically a closure overnight. The prospect that with the many regulatory challenges that Diablo faces, as articulated both by proponents and opponents, a business decision could be made by PG&E not to continue operation. There could be an event, hopefully not a catastrophic event, but one that could still require suspension of operations at the plant. There could be a seismic event. I was the author last year of the extension of the independent seismic safety oversight body. that will continue to operate as long as the plant is operating and licensed. We're keenly aware of the concerns of seismic safety. It is because of all those factors that we believe it is prudent for the state to authorize the PUC, to require the PUC to gather data. It's not just putting a minus sign in front of what we already know the positive benefits are. As amended, the bill will also look at potential positive benefits of a closure. But this bill is not advocating closure or continued operation. This bill is acting in the interest of all residents, including workforce at Diablo Canyon, to make sure that we are proactive in planning potential transitions that minimize the adverse impact on residents of San Luis Obispo County. And for those reasons, would request your aye vote. I would also just say that some of the amendments that were referred to, proposed amendments, we just received yesterday. As I've said to the opponents, we remain committed to continued conversation and dialogue. I think the bill has been improved with the support of your committee staff. We appreciate that work as well. Would ask for your aye vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Monning. I recall about 10 years ago, nuclear power began to make a resurgence in the world when certain countries in Europe found a way to minimize nuclear waste and increase productivity of these plants. But in my experience working here in California, I can tell you that I don't think nuclear power is in California's future. I don't think it's in the horizon. I see just all these different new sources of power coming on that are much more environmentally friendly, that are more productive, that are producing more power. I can go into detail, but I think generally the consensus, I think, of the legislature of leaders is that we want to move in a new direction. And I understand, having had a coal burning plant in my district, working to eliminate that, how it's very difficult to do. You need to address a lot of issues, and I can imagine how much more difficult it would be with a nuclear power plant. So I understand the difference in concerns. I don't think there are difference in concerns. I just think there's a different approach to handle this. I understand where the senator's going. There is a risk that we should be aware of, and I think we need to move forward carefully, evaluating those risks. And I think having more information to help us make decisions is not a bad thing. I think we'll need it. I think it's warranted that the state, as a collective unit, be involved in financing that, because the power affects the entire grid of the state of California. All the ratepayers, no matter what districts they're in and how they derive their power, affected by the way this energy is produced and distributed. So I'd like to recommend a yes vote and ask that somebody here make a motion. If we have a motion by Connie Leyva. Thank you, Senator. And we'll call the roll. Clerk, please call the roll.
Do pass as amended to appropriations. Wesso?
Aye.
Wesso, aye. Morel?
Aye.
Morel, aye. Canella? Aye. Canella, aye. Gaines? Aye. Gaines, aye. Hertzberg? Hill? Laura?
Aye.
Laura, aye. Leyva?
Aye.
Leyva, aye. McGuire? McGuire, aye. Pavley? Wolk? Has enough votes.
Has enough votes to make it our committee. We'll hold a roll open for absent members. Thank you, Senator. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, members.
We're going to call Senator Wachowski forward to present SB 1213. The Grant Boondoggle bill.
Good morning. This is a proactive bill. No, that's the last bill. So this is SB 1213, and it's a proactive bill. No, it's an important bill for the state of California, for the Bay Area, and I would argue for the world.